Danny O'Brien has been an activist for online free speech and privacy for over 20 years. In his home country of the UK, he fought against repressive anti-encryption law and helped found the Open Rights Group, Britain's own digital rights organization. He was EFF's activist from 2005 to 2007, its international outreach coordinator from 2007 to 2009, and international director from 2013 to 2019. He now supervises EFF's medium and long-term strategy with an eye to maintaining the organization's global impact and reputation. In a previous century, Danny wrote and performed the only one-man show about Usenet to have a successful run in London's West End. I included that line because Usenet is the beginning for a lot of us working on the internet and those kinds of news groups where the nucleation and formation for so many really great things. It's really truly an honor to be able to introduce Danny. I'm a huge fan of his work for over the years. I've read a lot of the pieces and perspectives and help that Danny has put out. And I've been the Epiphast project itself is super lucky to have been able to chat with Danny about our content policies and our how the strategy around how do we make sure that the network is used for good? How do we make sure at the same time that the network remains open and preserves rights and pushes our digital freedoms? And how do we kind of make sure to kind of sort of prevent problems, but at the same time, really make sure that rights are protected. So really, thank you so much, Danny, for joining us. And yeah, I'll let you take it away.
Juan asked me to speak, and as he read out that bio, I realized that Usenet, wow, that's a long time ago. And even before I was an activist, I spent about 20 years as a tech journalist. And I think the two skills you need as a tech journalist is one, to try and endeavor to be at the ground floor of any major tech revolution. So you can see what's happening. You can meet the people who are doing the work. And the other important thing is to fail to make any money out of that. This is what in journalism we describe as ethics. And I'm happy to say that, you know, I've been lucky enough to do both of those things over the 20 years in journalism. And I think one of the things that you sort of note as you go through each of these different transitions, for instance, I used to hang around before even Usenet bulletin boards with some of the people that went, in Britain at least, to start the microcomputer revolution. Then I moved in 2000 to Silicon Valley, just when the dot-com boom was collapsing, but the seeds of the Web 2.0 revolution were beginning there. I would sit in a basement with Bram Cohen as he hacked on BitTorrent, and I got to hang out at I guess the last really cypherpunk meetings, where of course a lot of the principles of the blockchain environment and many of the things that we're seeing 20 years later were first devised or projected. And in all of those situations, I think that one of the things that you always saw was, in retrospect, they seem overdetermined. They seem almost inevitable. But at the time, there's not only a great deal of skepticism externally, but there's also a lot of questions, even within the biggest advocates for those new ways of thinking. I mean, I think about the early days of free software and open source. I think one of the biggest, most convincing documents that led to, certainly I think led to Netscape open sourcing the what became Firefox, the Mozilla browser, was the Eric Raymond's article and the Cathedral and the Bazaar. And one of the things looking back and reading that is that it's actually a very, it's a document that's struggling to understand how you might build something like Linux in a decentralized way, given that seemed counterintuitive and near impossible, but yet of course it existed. And the same thing happened, I remember going back in time, talking to people who were around at the very early beginnings of the TCP/IP network design, who to a person would say, you know, we all assumed the structure would be centralized. We all assumed it would be an X500 system, and that packet switching and decentralized distribution of routes was seen as a fringe thing that we didn't think would work, even amongst the people who were sort of experimentally plotting this out, until it was built. And finally, I think maybe a bit more in recent memory, I remember talking to some of the people who were the pioneers of all of these decentralizing revolutions when Wikipedia first emerged. And the general consensus was that Wikipedia was doomed. that you know, you can push this decentralization idea too far. And that just simply throwing up a blank page and expecting people to construct an encyclopedia for everyone for free out of it was just assuming too much. Now, of course, as time goes on, one finds the flaws in each of these systems, and the critiques begin again. None of them are perfect. None of them are perfectly decentralized, and some of them exhibit some of the challenges of running a decentralized system. But we quickly forget just how impossible they seemed before there was a proof of existence. We talk about proof of work, we talk about proof of replication, but that existence proof is a key thing in expanding people's minds to the opportunities and the possibilities. And I see this now. Now I'm an activist, so I still have to keep an eye on the upcoming revolutions, and I still manage to not make any money out of them. But at the same time, what I've learned is that not only can people sort of fail to imagine the possibilities until they see it right in front of them, but they can also forget about the possibilities. And I'm hitting this now as I'm discussing the future of the internet with regulators. Regulators and lawmakers are, as I'm sure you can tell, as concerned as almost any of us about the concentration of power and the centralization of the big social media networks and the big tech companies. But when you talk to them, often their solutions don't take into account that there's even a future that exists without these tech giants. When you speak to lawmakers, I was in Europe recently, not so recently because of COVID, but a year or so ago, talking about the copyright directive, which was a proposal that actually got through, which was pretty designed to be a slap on the hands to the big US tech companies, to the Amazons and the Googles and the Facebooks of the world. I was saying to them, well, look, you know, one of the problems you're creating here is this really limits like alternative search engines, alternative decentralized solutions like Mastodon, like IPFS as a storage system that might find it impossible to comply with these regulations because they were written to control the big tech giants. And a lot of the feedback I got from those regulators is, what are you talking about? And there was a particular point where I was saying, what about European search engines? And I got blank stares because no one there could even imagine an alternative to Google. So I think we're at that fascinating point right now where not only do we face a terrible, disturbing unwinding of all of those revolutions that existed before as tech centralizes and creates a control system over our existing network. But also that people's imaginations are contracting. And that could have serious consequences. And I think the thing it most reminds me of in history is that, you know, 2000 years ago, we had an incredible flowering of democracy, at least in the Europe and the Middle East. The Greek and Roman cultures were both built on the idea and the possibility of democracy. They had their flaws. They weren't perfect democracies. They had slavery. The foreigners were viewed as people without rights, but they existed. And then as they stumbled and fell, not only did people begin to sort of forget those structures as they were replaced by emperors and kings. But they began to forget that this was even possible. And it took a renaissance, it took a revitalization to create proofs of existence that democracy was possible again. And so it's so vital to have a system in place like Filecoin, like IPFS, that shows a possibility, even if it's a latent possibility, even if it's a possibility that's going to require a lot of work to get right. And as again, with my kind of EFF hat on, and a little bit with my hat as an advisor now for the Foundation for the Decentralized Web, uh, one of the things that I'm encouraging all the developers in this environment to think about is to think about not only what you're building for your customers and for your users, but also as an existence proof to regulators and lawmakers and those who are thinking now about how the future should be. Because I can tell you there's nothing more compelling than opening up a laptop in front of a politician and saying, you know, this is how it could be, and this isn't something in the future. This is something that you can play with and look at and imagine with right now. So I guess that's my summary of my lightning talk. Think of yourselves not only as creators of the future, but also people who are carrying the candle of the past into that future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. I wonder if I could ask you a couple of questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely.
Awesome.
I always feel weird just talking into a camera like that.
No, this is hey, this is the future. Let's get used to it, at least for a while, until we're all wearing headsets and looking at each other in VR.
It's true.
Look, what you're describing is deeply, deeply important, and especially the notion of actually reaching out to regulators and legislators around the world to help people understand what's at stake and what the potential directions are, and how to. Everyone wants good futures. It's just we end up in bad futures because we fail to see how to get there, or we fail to communicate about them. How do you recommend that group, communities like ours start doing that? It makes sense to go in and talk to them with demos and all that kind of stuff. Is there some other broader, what, before we go in there and start doing that, what kind of work should we get done first? Like what kind of writings or communications should we prep?
Well, I think one of the things that I think about a lot when you're dealing with lawmakers is to make what you're doing legible. And one of the biggest challenges that any system that's built on just protocols is that by our very nature, we're very distributed. And the people who politicians can recognize the most are, big, centralized constituencies. When people formed unions, part of the reason is so that you have the head of a union that can go and speak to someone in power. And I'm not saying that we should form a union necessarily, but you have to think of some way of becoming visible that you can. Now that can be as simple as just going and visiting lawmakers. We're talking right now at EFF, we've just hired someone to represent us at the EU, because I think a lot of these decisions are being made in Brussels. And one of the things we're working on right now is to try and represent or bring representatives of what we call the public interest internet as an alternative to the Facebook view. And that's actually pretty powerful, because a lot of big tech, of course, is concentrated in the United States, but a lot of the thinking and work, including for IPFS and Filecoin, is taking place outside of the United States, in Europe and of course in China. So bringing in those voices really brings out how distinctive that is. And the other thing is like forming allegiances and allies with other people working in this area. So I think sometimes we think of this space as being very competitive. There are lots of alternative protocols. Everyone's jockeying for position. But when you're trying to talk to the rest of the world about what you're doing, there's such a strength in unity and talking together and saying, look, we don't know which one of us will be the future, but it doesn't matter. We all need these basic understandings in the people who run our governments.
Yeah. One of the things that's been fueling and powering a lot of the Web3 movement and the kind of resurgence of call for the decentralizing the web, has been a set of principles around various kind of basic freedoms that are almost human right or are
Yeah.
straight up human rights in the offline world in meat space, but are not necessarily clear digital rights in the internet. So we're talking about things like freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, being able to communicate with each other freely, freedom, sovereignty over your identity and your data, data property rights. So things around your own personal data and how it's used and what should you know about it, and also the monetization flows of that property,
Right.
and so on. So I'm curious how you see these fights evolving over time. What are the hopes? What are the maybe things we should focus on in the shorter term, like maybe 1 to 2 years, 3 years out, to kind of help establish these kinds of rights?
Yeah. So our experience at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and we've now got 30 years of experience of this, is definitely, the struggle with explaining to not just lawmakers, but also to judges and the general public, is that it's partly that proof of existence. It's partly that we saw a huge sea change in lawmakers' opinions when they started ripping CDs, for instance, right? We could explain the dangers of DRM, and we could explain the limitations of a really maximalist view of copyright when they were actually doing that for themselves for the first time. So some of it is about like that thing that you use, that thing needs these protections, and you will lose these rights if laws are passed to challenge that. But I also think that some of this can be down to just like picking the right analogies, and also talking to people as citizens rather than participants in an industry. And I think in the blockchain environment, you've talked about, freedom of association, freedom of being able to have some degree of privacy in your financial transactions, right? And not have them go through central choke points. And of course, the analogy here is always money, cash money. But another thing that's sort of important is to point out to people that what we're talking about here is a democratization and decentralization of finance. And the laws that you might apply to control centralized financial systems, which are very invasive of privacy for a lot of, well-argued reasons, don't work if it's applied to everyone, right? That something that works for a particular, particularly powerful industry cannot work at like the individual level or the citizen level. We just don't run society in the same way as we run our banks or we run our prisons. And again, trying to point out and speak up as citizens, I think really helps make this argument. They're used to talking to the Mark Zuckerbergs and the Sergey Brins of the world, and they know where they're coming from. But if you have people coming up and saying, "Hey, I don't have any of that. I'm not here because I'm a billionaire. I'm here because I want to be able to exercise my rights." It's hard to believe, but actually politicians are often receptive to that because that's why they're doing their job.
Yeah, that makes it. Thank you so much for that perspective. Any kind of words of advice for the community as we head into the next months and years?
Well, the first time we met, one of the things I said was that just it's really important for us to know what's happening here on the frontier, what's really happening at the edges. And just if you see anything, I mean, I sound like the opposite of what I am, which is like, if you see something, tell someone. But I'm not suggesting a global mass surveillance system for human rights violations. But if you see something, if you do have a question, right, about like how are we going to conduct, like how are we going to prevent like harmful material, like what happens if law enforcement comes to me as someone who is storing data or running a node, or or so forth. Drop me a line at EFF, drop us a line, because as we understand, the frontier is in our name, right? As we understand like what's happening in these edge cases, we can set the precedents in the courts and in front of lawmakers to make sure that we can anticipate what everybody else will be doing in 5 to 10 years time. So you're kind of canaries in the coal mine, and we like looking after canaries.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And one of the goals of the community is also to try and help avoid the problems that are rampant now, and again, social media misinformation landscape. Like in the last talk, we were delving a little bit into that. Some of us are pretty worried that decentralizing these social flows might make a bunch of the problems worse.
Yeah.
It might make some problems better, so it's harder to control, harder to censor, harder to explicitly target particular parties, harder to understand all the data points about people and so on, so harder to exploit. But at the same time, harder to actually understand what's going on, easier for bad things to happen without anybody really being alerted, and so on. So maybe some guiding principles as these things haven't been built yet, but they probably will be within the next year to 3 years. These kind of decentralized social networks that might replace the centralized ones. Any kind of principles for the people building those that they should?
I think there's two elements to this. One is that it's always easier to centralize, right? It's always easy to like assume a beneficial dictator, and then the problem is solved, right? And this is one of the reasons why things re-centralized, is that people go, maybe it's better if we just let Mark Zuckerberg be in charge of these things. At least we can drag him to a subcommittee if it's gone wrong. And then, of course, it goes wrong. All of these problems are problems that the centralized systems were supposed to be fantastic at solving, right? Moderation, real names was supposed to be this brilliant way of making everybody responsible and friendly on the internet. And in fact, created the opposite. So it's important to realize that the simple solution doesn't always solve the problem. And the other thing is that we can't predict. I can't tell you the solution to moderation and disinformation, but what I can tell you is that the obvious solutions don't work, because we've obviously tried them. There are very smart people in all of these places working on this, which means we need to have a diversity of responses, right? We need to be able to experiment and try things out. So on you and I's place in that is to make sure that diversity can exist without people going, Reddit should be banned, rather than Reddit should learn to be better about dealing with these situations. And the second one is as developers and creators, be willing to try something new and try something out, and read about other people's mistakes, right? There's now 30 years, 40 years, 50 years of reputation system thought and network analysis. There are some brilliant social scientists who are writing really good stuff. They're not the people who like just angrily rant on Twitter. They're people who Dana Boyd at the Data and Society Institute is fantastic, and her colleagues are brilliant at this, who are actually trying to solve the problem. And you can scoop that out, you can build it into your system, and who's amazed, maybe you'll crack it.
Thank you very much, Danny. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for the inspiration and for the guidance, and looking forward to many years ahead working on this together.
I'm really looking forward to it. Thanks a lot.